Close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath in, and let it go. Tonight we are traveling somewhere ancient, somewhere that exists at the edge of what the human mind can comfortably hold. A place so layered in mystery, so dense with the weight of time and human presence and geological wonder, that to stand in it is to feel the ordinary world fall away, like a coat you no longer need. We are going to Arizona. Not the Arizona of highway rest stops and summer heat warnings and the familiar postcard image of a saguaro cactus silhouetted against an orange sky. Not the Arizona of spring training baseball and retirement communities and the neon glow of Scottsdale on a Saturday night. We are going to the other Arizona. The Arizona that existed before any of those things, the Arizona that was old beyond reckoning when the first European eyes blinked in confusion at its landscape and tried to find words for what they were seeing. The Arizona of red rock canyons cut so deep that the bottom receives only a few hours of direct sunlight each day. The Arizona of ancient pueblos built into cliff faces so sheer and so high that modern climbers would respect the roots to their doorways. The Arizona of painted desert and petrified forest, and the largest and best preserved meteor impact crater on the surface of the earth. The Arizona of the Grand Canyon, that rupture in the surface of the planet so vast that the first people to see it could not make themselves believe that water had made it. This is the Arizona we are visiting tonight, slowly, quietly, with all the patience that ancient things deserve. So let your body settle into wherever you are resting. Let your breathing find its natural rhythm, slow and deep and unforced. Let the sounds of the ordinary world soften and recede. We have a long night ahead of us, and there is nowhere else you need to be. The first thing you need to understand about Arizona is its age. Not its age as a state, which is relatively young, having entered the Union only in 1912, the last of the contiguous 48. Not even its age as a landscape in the human sense, the thousands of years of indigenous occupation that preceded European contact. The age of the rock itself. The oldest rocks exposed in the walls of the Grand Canyon are nearly 2 billion years old. 2 billion years. In the time since those rocks were formed, in the deep heat and pressure of the early Earth's interior, life on this planet has gone from simple, single-celled organisms to every complex living thing that exists today. Continents have assembled and broken apart multiple times. The atmosphere has been transformed from a toxic mix of volcanic gases to the oxygen-rich air that makes your lungs work right now. And those rocks have been here through all of it, compressed and metamorphosed by the unimaginable forces of the deep earth. Then slowly, over hundreds of millions of years, covered by layer upon layer of sediment, deposited in seas and rivers and deserts that no longer exist. Then, beginning perhaps 5 or 6 million years ago, carved by the Colorado River into the greatest canyon on the surface of the planet. The Grand Canyon is not just a beautiful place, it is a library written in the language of geology, each layer of rock a chapter in a story that stretches back 2 billion years. The Vishnu schist at the bottom, dark and ancient and almost incomprehensibly old. Above it, the Tapete sandstone, laid down in a shallow sea over 500 million years ago. Above that, the bright Angel Shale, where the fossils of early marine life are preserved in the pale grey rock. Layer above layer, each one a different world, a different epoch, a different version of the planet that now supports your life. and carved through all of it the Colorado River. That river has been cutting this canyon for approximately 5 to 6 million years. The rate of cutting has not been constant. In wet periods, when the river ran high and powerful, it cut faster. In dry periods, slower. But the direction has always been the same: down. Always down, following the gradient of the landscape toward the sea. The result is a canyon 277 miles long, up to 18 miles wide, and over a mile deep in its deepest section. These numbers, stated plainly, do not convey the reality of the place. The Grand Canyon is one of those features of the natural world that resists description, not because language is inadequate, but because the human nervous system is not designed to perceive things at that scale. Standing at the rim and looking out, the brain simply refuses to accept what the eyes are reporting. The Spanish conquistador Garcia López de Cárdenas was the first European to see it in 1540. He sent 3 of his men down to the river, which from the rim appeared to be a thin, brown ribbon easily within reach. After an entire day of trying, the men turned back. They had reached, they reported, only about a third of the way down. What had looked from the rim like boulders the size of a man were in fact taller than the Great Tower of Seville. The canyon had defeated their sense of scale entirely. It defeats everyone's sense of scale. That is part of what makes it, beyond its geological significance and its natural beauty, a genuinely mysterious place. A place where the ordinary tools the human mind uses to navigate the world simply stop working. The ancient peoples who lived on and around the canyon for thousands of years understood this. They did not try to reduce the canyon to a manageable size. They incorporated its incomprehensibility into their understanding of the world. The canyon was not a problem to be solved. It was a presence to be lived with, a feature of existence as fundamental as the sky or the river itself. And in their living with it across thousands of years, they left behind mysteries that we are still trying to understand. The first humans arrived in what is now Arizona approximately 13,000 years ago, perhaps earlier. The evidence, as in Texas, keeps pushing the dates back as new sites are found and new dating techniques are applied. They arrived in a landscape very different from the Arizona of today. The climate was cooler and wetter. The desert that now covers much of the state was less extensive, less absolute. Woodlands of pinon pine and juniper reached further down into the valleys. Grasslands covered areas that are now bare rock and sparse scrub. The rivers ran fuller and more reliably, fed by the melting of glaciers in the mountains of the north and by a pattern of precipitation that the changing climate of the post-Ice Age world would eventually disrupt. And the animals. Like Texas, like the rest of North America at that time, Arizona was home to megafauna now extinct. Mammoths, though the Columbian mammoth of the southwest was somewhat different from its northern relatives. Mastodons, ancient horses, camels, giant ground sloths, and the predators that preyed on them, dire wolves and American lions, and the great, short-faced bear, the largest bear that has ever lived in North America. The first Arizonans hunted these animals at a site called Murray Springs in the San Pedro Valley of southeastern Arizona. Archaeologists found the remains of a mammoth kill. The bones lay in what had once been a shallow pond, the animal apparently having been driven into the mud where it was easier to approach and kill. Around and beneath the bones, Clovis points, the distinctive fluted spear tips that mark the presence of the earliest well-documented hunters in North America. The mammoth had been butchered where it fell. The bones were cracked for marrow. Every useful part of the enormous animal had been processed and taken. Nothing was wasted. This was not the work of people who did not understand what they were doing. This was systematic, efficient, expert hunting and butchery. The work of people who had been doing this for a very long time, whose knowledge of mammoth behavior and anatomy had been built up across generations of practice. The Clovis hunters of the San Pedro Valley were not primitive. They were masters of a specific and demanding craft. And the mammoths they hunted were, by any measure, formidable animals whose successful killing required not just courage, but intelligence and planning and the coordinated effort of multiple hunters working together. That coordination required communication, language, social structure, the ability to plan ahead, to think about tomorrow's hunt while sitting by tonight's fire. All of the things that make us human. The Clovis hunters had all of them, and then the mammoths were gone. The exact cause of the megafauna extinctions in Arizona, as elsewhere, remains debated. Climate change, human hunting, or some combination of both. The end of the Ice Age brought rapid warming and drying to the southwest. The grasslands that supported the megafauna shrank. The woodlands retreated to higher elevations. The shallow ponds and springs where mammoths watered dried up or became seasonal. The world the megafauna had evolved for was changing faster than they could adapt, and the hunters were there always, following the herds, taking what the herds offered. Whether the extinction was inevitable without human hunting, or whether human hunting was the final pressure that tipped already stressed populations into collapse, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that within a few thousand years of the arrival of human beings in Arizona, the mammoths were gone, and the people who had hunted them adapted, as people always do, as people always have. In the high country of northeastern Arizona, where the land rises toward the Colorado Plateau, and the air carries the sharp, resinous scent of ponderosa pine, and the summer thunderstorms come in fast and dramatic over the red rock mesas, there is a place called Canyon de Chelly. It is pronounced, roughly, Canyon de Che, the French phonetics of a Spanish rendering of a Navajo word that means something like rock canyon. The name itself is a small mystery, a palimpsest of languages layered over the original name that the canyon's first human inhabitants gave it, which we do not know. The canyon is not the largest in Arizona, not the most famous, not the most visited, but it may be the most continuously inhabited place in the American Southwest, and possibly one of the most continuously inhabited places in all of North America. People have been living in Canyon de Chelly for approximately 5,000 years. 5,000 years. The same canyon, the same red sandstone walls rising 700 to 1,000 feet above the canyon floor. The same stream running along the bottom, cottonwood trees lining its banks, their leaves turning gold in autumn and trembling in the slightest breeze in summer. The same hawks riding the thermals above the rim, the same stars visible in the narrow band of sky between the canyon walls at night. And through all 5,000 years, people. The earliest inhabitants were the archaic peoples, those hunter-gatherers who occupied the southwest before agriculture arrived, living in temporary camps on the canyon floor, and in the shallow caves of the lower walls, they left behind pictographs, images painted on the rock in red and white pigments, the earliest layers of a visual record that would accumulate across 5 millennia into one of the most remarkable concentrations of rock art in North America. Then, beginning approximately 2,000 years ago, the basket makers. The name was given to them by archaeologists who were struck by the extraordinary quality of the baskets found in their sites, woven with a skill and artistry that suggested long tradition and deep expertise. The basket makers grew corn and squash in the canyon bottom, supplementing their diet with hunting and gathering. They built semi-subterranean structures, pit houses dug into the earth and roofed with timber and mud that provided warmth in winter and coolness in summer. And they made baskets. The basket maker baskets of Canyon de Chelly are among the most beautiful objects produced by any ancient culture in North America. Woven from yucca fiber and sumac in geometric patterns of extraordinary complexity, they were used for carrying and storing and cooking, for holding the seeds of the next year's planting, for carrying water when coated with pitch to make them waterproof. They were also, judging by the care with which they were made, and the context in which some were found, objects of significance beyond the merely practical. Beauty has always been a signal of importance. When ancient people invested the effort to make something more beautiful than it strictly needed to be, they were communicating something. About the value they placed on the object, about their relationship to the tradition of making it, about their understanding of the world and their place in it. The basket makers understood this, and then, around 1,000 years ago, their descendants built something even more remarkable. They built up. Instead of living on the canyon floor or in pit houses dug into it, they began building multi-story stone structures in the alcoves of the canyon walls. Natural overhangs in the sandstone carved by the differential erosion of harder and softer layers of rock provided sheltered spaces high above the canyon floor. Into these alcoves, the people now known as the ancestral Puebloans built rooms. Dozens of rooms, sometimes hundreds, stacked on top of each other, accessed by ladders, their walls of precisely fitted sandstone blocks mortared with a mud plaster that has survived 1,000 years of temperature fluctuation and occasional moisture. The most famous of these cliff dwellings at Canyon de Chelly is called the White House. It takes its modern name from a section of white plaster that still adheres to the upper portion of the ruin, bright against the dark red of the canyon wall even 1,000 years after it was applied. The lower portion sits on the canyon floor. The upper portion is built into an alcove in the cliff face, accessible in ancient times by a series of hand and toe-hold trails cut into the rock face, trails so narrow and so exposed that most modern visitors are content to view the ruin from the canyon rim or the trail below. Standing at the canyon rim and looking down at the White House 1,000 feet below, you feel something that is both vertigo and wonder. The ruin is both tiny and precise at this distance, each room visible as a dark rectangle in the white plaster, the whole structure fitting into its alcove with a neatness that suggests the builders chose their location with great care. Why here? Why build a home in a cliff face 100 feet above the canyon floor, accessible only by a nerve-testing climb and requiring every load of building material to be carried up the same route? The answers most commonly given involve defense. A dwelling in a cliff face is difficult to attack. The canyon bottom can be watched from above. Retreat, if necessary, is upward into terrain that defenders know better than any attacker. But defense is not the whole story. The alcoves of Canyon de Chelly have another quality that anyone who has spent time in them understands immediately. They are sheltered. The overhang above keeps off the rain and the direct summer sun. The cliff face behind retains the heat of the day and releases it slowly through the cold desert nights. The exposure of most alcoves to the south or southeast means that the winter sun low on the horizon penetrates deep into the shelter, warming the interior during the coldest months. These are passive solar structures, built by people who understood, through long observation and accumulated experience, how the sun moved through the sky across the seasons. How to orient a building to take maximum advantage of winter warmth and summer shade. How the thermal mass of stone and adobe could moderate the extreme temperature swings of the desert environment. This knowledge was not theoretical, it was practical. It was the knowledge of people who had been building in this landscape for 1,000 years, who had learned from the buildings of their ancestors what worked and what did not, who had refined and improved and passed on the wisdom of making a comfortable home in a difficult environment. It is, by any reasonable definition, architecture, sophisticated, environmentally responsive, beautifully crafted architecture, and it is 1,000 years old. The abandonment of the cliff dwellings of Canyon de Chelly, sometime around 1300 of the Common Era, is one of the great mysteries of southwestern archaeology. Not just Canyon de Chelly. Across the entire Colorado Plateau, across the vast network of ancestral Puebloan communities that had flourished for centuries in the canyon country of Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico, the same thing happened within roughly the same period of time. The great houses were left, the cliff dwellings were vacated, the carefully tended fields were abandoned to the encroaching desert, and the people moved, south mostly, and east toward the Rio Grande Valley of New Mexico, toward the desert basins of southern Arizona, away from the canyon country that their ancestors had occupied for 1,000 years. Why? The evidence points once again to drought. The period between approximately 1276 and 1299 is known in the paleoclimatological record as the Great Drought of the late 13th century. Tree ring data, that extraordinarily precise record of year-by-year rainfall preserved in the growth rings of ancient trees, shows that this period was one of the driest in the past 2,000 years. For farming communities in a landscape that was already marginal for agriculture, dependent on the reliable summer monsoons and the winter snowpack for their water, a drought of this severity and duration was catastrophic. Crops failed, stored food ran out, the elaborate social systems that had distributed resources between communities in normal times were overwhelmed by the scale of the need. And perhaps also something more. There is evidence in the archaeological record of this period of social stress that goes beyond simple resource scarcity. Evidence of violence, of communities raiding each other for food, of a breakdown in the cooperative relationships that had sustained the ancestral Puebloan network for centuries. Some researchers have suggested that the abandonment was not purely a response to drought, but was driven also by a kind of social collapse. That the elaborate ceremonial and political systems of the ancestral Puebloans had become so complex, so demanding of resources and compliance, that when the stress of drought was added to the system, the whole thing fractured. People did not just move because they were hungry. They moved because the world they had built was no longer working, because the promises their society had made to them, the promises of order and security and shared purpose, could no longer be kept. They moved towards something new, and what they built in their new homes in the Rio Grande Valley and the Hopi Mesas and the other places where ancestral Puebloan communities re-established themselves was different from what they had left. Informed by the experience of what had happened, adapted to the new circumstances, the descendants of those who left Canyon de Chelly are alive today. The Hopi people, whose villages on the mesas of northeastern Arizona are among the oldest continuously inhabited communities in North America, trace their ancestry directly to the ancestral Puebloans. The Zuni, the various Pueblo peoples of the Rio Grande Valley, all of them carry in their traditions, their ceremonies, their very DNA, the memory of the canyon country they once inhabited. They did not disappear. They transformed. And the canyon they left behind held their memory. The cliff dwellings stand empty in the alcoves. The plaster still clings to the walls in places. The hand and toe-hold trails still climb the cliff faces. And the canyon remembers everything. Breathe slowly now. Feel the weight of 5,000 years of human habitation settling gently around you. 5,000 years of people waking in the morning in this canyon, making their fires, tending their fields, teaching their children, burying their dead, looking up at the same band of stars visible between the canyon walls at night. All of that time, all of those lives, and the canyon still here, still receiving the light of the same sun, still sheltering the same cottonwood trees along its floor, still waiting, in its patient way, for whoever comes next. You are not separate from that patience. You are part of it. Rest in it now. Let the ancient canyon hold you, as it has always held everything that comes to it. Further west, in the Sonoran Desert that covers much of southern Arizona, a different kind of ancient mystery waits, the Hohokam. The name comes from the O-Odom language and means, roughly, those who have gone or those who have used up. It was the name given by the O-Odom people to the ancient civilization, whose ruins they found when they arrived in the Sonoran Desert, a civilization they recognized as ancestral to themselves but separated by time and change. The Hohokam occupied the Sonoran Desert of southern Arizona from roughly 1 CE to approximately 1450 CE. That is a span of 1400 years, longer than the distance from the Norman conquest of England to the present day. In that 1400 years, they built something that has no parallel in ancient North America. They built an irrigation system, not a simple system of ditches redirecting a stream, an elaborate engineered network of canals extending for hundreds of miles through the desert floor, capable of delivering water from the Salt and Gila rivers to fields far removed from the riverbank. At its height, the Hohokam Canal system in the area around what is now Phoenix extended for more than 500 miles of main canals, with additional secondary and tertiary distribution channels extending the network further still. 500 miles of canals dug by hand, no metal tools, no wheeled vehicles, no draft animals, just human labor, organized and sustained across generations, moving enormous quantities of desert soil to create the infrastructure that made farming in one of the driest environments in North America not just possible, but productive. The engineering of the Hohokam canals is remarkable. The main canals were dug to precise gradients, shallow enough that water would flow without losing too much to seepage, but steep enough that the water moved consistently without stagnating. The calculations required to achieve this over miles of variable terrain, without surveying instruments, without mathematics in any formal written sense, were accomplished through empirical knowledge accumulated over generations. Hohokam engineers knew how water behaved. They knew the landscape of the Salt River Valley with the intimacy that comes from generations of working it, and they translated that knowledge into canals that worked. When modern engineers in the 19th and early 20th centuries began building the irrigation system that would transform Phoenix into a modern city, they did not start from scratch. They followed, in many cases, the routes of the Hohokam canals. The ancient engineers had already identified the optimal routes through the landscape. The modern engineers simply made those routes wider and deeper and lined them with concrete. The Hohokam had solved the engineering problem 1400 years earlier. The scale of the Hohokam civilization was not just hydraulic. At their peak, between approximately 700 and 1150 CE, the Hohokam built platform mounds, large earthen structures similar in function to those of the Caddo in East Texas. At a site called Snaketown, which was occupied continuously for over 1,000 years, archaeologists found one of the most extensive Hohokam communities yet documented. Dozens of mounds, hundreds of pit structures, evidence of a population in the thousands living in a single community in the middle of the Sonoran Desert. They made pottery of extraordinary quality. Hohokam ceramics are instantly recognizable, their red on buff-painted surfaces decorated with geometric and figurative designs of great sophistication. Human figures, animals, abstract patterns, all rendered in a style that is consistent across centuries and across the full geographic range of the Hohokam world, suggesting a shared artistic tradition maintained across a large and diverse population. They played ball games, ball courts, oval depressions in the desert floor lined with caliche, a hardened calcium carbonate layer common in desert soils, have been found at Hohokam sites across southern Arizona. The courts are unmistakably similar to the ball courts of Mesoamerica, the rubber ball games played by the Olmec and Maya and Aztec civilizations far to the south. The presence of these courts in the Hohokam world is one of the clearest pieces of evidence for the extensive connections between the ancient Southwest and the civilizations of Mexico, connections that brought ideas and objects, and perhaps people across the desert landscapes between them. What did the Hohokam ball game mean? Was it a sport in our sense, a competitive game played for entertainment and the pleasure of athletic skill? Was it a ritual, the outcome carrying cosmological significance, the game a means of communicating with powers that governed the rain and the harvest? Was it both, as it seems to have been in some Mesoamerican contexts? We do not know. The ball courts are there. The evidence of the games is there. The connection to the broader Mesoamerican ball game tradition is apparent, but the specific meaning, the rules, the social context, the things that the Hohokam themselves understood to be at stake when the game was played, that knowledge is gone. The courts are empty now. The caliche walls have eroded. The smooth desert floor of the playing area has been disturbed by centuries of wind and rain and the activities of subsequent occupants. But the shape remains, and in the shape, the unmistakable intention of people who wanted to play this game, who considered it important enough to invest the labor of constructing a formal venue for it, who built it in the middle of their community, where everyone could see it and attend it and be part of whatever it meant. That importance was real, and it echoes faintly but persistently across 1,000 years of silence. The mystery of the Hohokam collapse is as deep and as debated as the mystery of the ancestral Puebloan abandonment. By 1450 CE, the Great Canal System was no longer functioning. The platform mounds were abandoned. The distinctive Hohokam ceramic tradition had ceased. The communities that had sustained themselves in the Sonoran Desert for 1,400 years were gone, or transformed beyond recognition. What happened? The evidence suggests multiple causes operating simultaneously, the familiar story of ancient collapses. Extended drought disrupted the agricultural system. Flooding, paradoxically, may have also played a role. In wet years, the Salt and Gila rivers could rise dramatically, damaging canal headworks and depositing silt that clogged the carefully maintained channels. Maintaining the system required constant labor and constant organization, and when the social structures that organized that labor weakened, the canals degraded. There is also evidence of conflict, of communities fortifying their settlements, of violence leaving its marks on the archaeological record, and there may have been soil degradation. 1,400 years of irrigation in a desert environment can lead to the accumulation of salts in the soil as water evaporates and leaves its mineral content behind. Salt-damaged soil produces progressively smaller harvests. Eventually it produces nothing at all. The Hohokam may have been in part the victims of their own success. Their irrigation system allowed them to build a civilization in the desert, but the long-term consequences of that irrigation, the salt accumulation, the soil compaction, the drawdown of the water table, may have ultimately made the desert uninhabitable for the kind of intensive agriculture their population required. They did not disappear. Their descendants are the O'odham people of southern Arizona, the Tohono O'odham and the Akimel O'odham, who live in this desert today and carry in their traditions and their language and their relationship to the land the living memory of what the Hohokam built. But the great civilization, the canals and the mounds and the ball courts and the red on-buff pottery, that specific expression of human ingenuity and organization in the Sonoran Desert, that is gone. And in its going, it left behind one of the most haunting questions in American archaeology. How does a civilization that solved the engineering problem of farming in a desert, that sustained itself for 1,400 years in one of the most challenging environments on the continent, how does such a civilization end? The answer is, as always, complicated, and as always, it begins with water. There is a mesa in northeastern Arizona that rises from the desert floor like something placed there by a deliberate hand. 3 fingers of sandstone extending south from the larger Black Mesa, their flat tops rising 1,000 feet above the surrounding desert. The land around them is the Painted Desert, a landscape of extraordinary and somewhat unearthly color. the exposed sedimentary layers of the Colorado Plateau, painted in stripes of red and orange and purple and grey and white, that shift and glow as the sun moves across them. On these three mesas, for at least 1,000 years, the Hopi have lived. The village of Old Urabi, on Third Mesa, is widely considered one of the oldest continuously inhabited communities in North America. Archaeological evidence suggests it has been occupied since approximately 1100 CE. 900 years of continuous habitation. 900 years of people waking in the same village, looking out at the same desert horizon, maintaining the same ceremonies, speaking variations of the same language. The Hopi did not choose these mesas arbitrarily. The mesas are defensible. They rise abruptly from the surrounding plain, their sides steep enough that approach from below is difficult and visible from a distance. In a world where conflict between communities was a real and persistent danger, the mesas offered a security that the flat desert floor could not provide. But the mesas were also spiritually significant. The Hopi understanding of their world is organized around a complex cosmology in which the landscape is not simply a physical setting for human life, but a living system of relationships, of places that carry meaning and power, of directions and orientations that connect the visible world to the invisible one. The mesas sit at the center of this world. They are not just where the Hopi happen to live. They are where the Hopi are supposed to live, where the migrations of their ancestors, following the instructions of their spiritual guides, finally brought them to rest. The Hopi emergence story, the narrative that explains how the Hopi people came to be in this world and how they came to live on these mesas, is one of the most complex and philosophically rich origin accounts in any human culture. It describes a world that exists in layers. The current world, the fourth world, was preceded by three earlier worlds, each of which was destroyed when the people living in it failed to maintain the right relationship with the forces that governed it. The survivors of each destruction emerge through a hole in the floor of the next world up, the Sipapu, a small opening in the earth that is represented symbolically in the kivas, the semi-subterranean ceremonial chambers that are central to Hopi religious life. The emergence into the fourth world, the current world, was followed by a long period of migration. The Hopi clans moved across the landscape, following signs and instructions, establishing their presence in different places before being called to gather on the mesas of northeastern Arizona. The ruins of ancient Puebloan communities across the southwest, including many of the cliff dwellings and great houses we have already visited, are understood by the Hopi as the marks of their own ancestors' migrations. Not the ruins of a lost civilization, mysterious and disconnected from the present, but the waypoints of a journey. The evidence of where their clans stopped and built and lived before moving on toward the final destination. The Hopi and the ruins are part of the same story. That understanding changes how you look at the ancient sites of the Southwest. They are not abandoned. They are not lost. They are stations on a journey that is still, in some sense, continuing. The kiva is the center of Hopi ceremonial life, a semi-subterranean chamber entered from above by a ladder through a hole in the roof, round or rectangular, depending on the tradition and the period. The walls plastered with mud, sometimes painted with ceremonial designs, a fire pit in the center, a ventilation shaft to bring fresh air, and in the floor always the small depression that represents the sipapu, the entrance to the underworld, the place from which the people emerged. The kiva is a symbolic universe. The floor represents the underworld. The level of the benches around the walls represents the surface of the earth. The roof represents the sky. And the ladder that connects the entrance hole to the interior represents the axis that connects all the three levels, the pole around which the cosmos turns. To descend into a kiva is, symbolically, to enter the earth, to undergo a kind of death, to go to the place from which life emerges, and to emerge again through the roof opening is to be reborn, to participate in the cycle of death and renewal that governs everything. Kivas have been built in the southwest for over 1,000 years. The earliest examples at ancestral Puebloan sites like those of Chaco Canyon in New Mexico and the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde in Colorado are already complex and fully developed, suggesting a tradition that had been refined over a long period before the first surviving examples were built. And the kiva tradition is still alive. The Hopi still build kivas, still use them for the ceremonies that maintain the relationship between the human world and the powers that govern it. The ceremonies performed in Hopi kivas today are not identical to those performed 1,000 years ago, but they are part of the same continuing tradition, the same understanding of the world, the same cosmological framework, refined and adapted across 1,000 years of practice. This continuity is extraordinary in a world where most ancient religious traditions survive only as texts, as archaeological ruins, as the subjects of scholarly interpretation. The Hopi ceremonial tradition is alive, still practiced, still meaningful to the people who maintain it. And much of it is secret. Not secret in the sense of hidden from the outside world, for reasons of power or exclusivity, but secret in the deeper sense that the knowledge it contains is sacred, that it carries a weight and a significance that makes casual sharing inappropriate, that it belongs to the tradition and the community in a way that makes it not freely available to curious outsiders. This is another form of mystery, not the mystery of lost knowledge, the mystery of living knowledge that is deliberately, carefully, respectfully withheld. The Hopi know things about their ceremonies and their cosmology and their relationship with the landscape of northeastern Arizona that they have chosen not to share with the wider world. That choice is theirs to make. It reflects a kind of wisdom about the nature of knowledge and the contexts in which it is appropriate. And in that withheld knowledge, there is a reminder. Not everything that is mysterious is lost. Some things are simply not ours to know. The petrified forest of northeastern Arizona is one of the strangest landscapes on the surface of the earth. It does not look like a forest. There are no standing trees, no canopy of leaves, no undergrowth. It looks, at first glance, like a desert plain scattered with logs, which is almost exactly what it is, except that the logs are 225 million years old, and they are made of stone. During the Triassic period, before the age of the dinosaurs had fully begun, what is now the Colorado Plateau was a vast floodplain crossed by rivers draining from highlands to the south and west. The climate was wet. Forests of enormous trees, ancestral relatives of modern conifers, grew along the river banks and spread across the floodplain. When these trees died, many of them were swept by floods into the rivers and carried downstream, they were buried under the sediment of the riverbed. In the dark and the pressure of burial, something extraordinary happened. The wood of the trees was slowly replaced, molecule by molecule, by silica, the same mineral that makes up quartz and flint. The cellular structure of the wood was preserved with extraordinary fidelity. The rings, the vessels, even in some cases the microscopic details of the wood cells themselves. But the organic material was entirely replaced by mineral. The trees became stone. They became stone in colours that seem almost deliberate in their beauty. The silica that replaced the wood was not pure. It contained trace amounts of iron and manganese and other minerals that stained it in shades of red and orange and yellow and purple and blue and white, the colours varying from log to log, and sometimes from one end of a single log to the other. 225 million years of burial followed. The soft sediments above the logs were compressed into mudstone and sandstone. Slower, deeper processes acted on the buried stone trees. And then, beginning in the last few million years, the Colorado Plateau began to rise. The rivers that crossed it cut deeper into the sediments, exposing older and older layers. The soft rock above the petrified logs eroded away, and the logs themselves, harder than the surrounding sediments, were left behind on the surface, scattered across the landscape in a way that looks almost random, like lumber delivered to a building site by an uncaring driver, but not random. Each log lying where it fell when the sediment above it finally eroded away, following the slope of the land as it has done since it first emerged from its long burial. The ancient peoples of the region found these stone logs and were not confused by them. They used them. The silica that replaced the wood of the ancient trees is essentially the same material as flint, and like flint it can be knapped, worked into cutting edges and tools. The petrified wood of the petrified forest was used by the ancient peoples of the region as a tool material, gathered and worked into points and blades and scrapers. They also built with it. At a site within the petrified forest called Puerco Pueblo, the ruins of a Pueblo community occupied approximately between 1250 and 1380 CE. The walls are built in part from blocks of petrified wood, their swirling red and orange colours visible in the masonry. The ancient builders used what was available. The material of their walls was made of material that had been a forest 225 million years before their time. A detail so strange considered carefully that it begins to dissolve the ordinary sense of the distance between ancient and modern, between natural and human, between the deep past and the present moment. The stone trees of the Triassic period ended up in the walls of a medieval pueblo, and those walls are still there. Near the south rim of the Grand Canyon, on a rocky promontory overlooking one of the most dramatic views in the world, there is a small ruin. It is not well known. Most of the millions of visitors who come to the Grand Canyon each year never see it. It sits outside the main tourist areas, accessible by a short hike across rocky terrain that most visitors do not attempt. But for those who find it, it offers something that the famous viewpoints do not: silence. And the sense that you are standing where someone else stood 1,000 years ago, looking at exactly the same view. The ruin is called Desert View Watchtower, except that the original structure is not the famous circular tower built by architect Mary Coulter in 1932, which was itself modelled on ancient ancestral Puebloan towers and incorporated genuine ancient masonry into its construction. The original ruin predates Coulter's building by many centuries. Why did the ancient people build here? The view is the obvious answer, and it is not a trivial one. From this point on, the South Rim, the Grand Canyon, spreads out in all directions with a comprehensiveness that no other single viewpoint quite matches. You can see the river far below, the layered walls of the canyon stretching to the horizon, the North Rim miles distant but clearly visible, and on clear days the peaks of mountains 100 miles away. A person stationed here could see anyone approaching from any direction across a vast area of the surrounding plateau. A watchtower, then, in the most literal sense, but also, perhaps, something more. The ancient peoples of the Southwest built towers for multiple purposes. Defense and observation were certainly among them, but towers also had cosmological significance in many Puebloan traditions. They marked places of power. They connected the earth to the sky. They were oriented, sometimes, to astronomical events, aligned to the rising or setting of specific stars, or to the solstice sun. Whether the tower at Desert View had such significance, we cannot say. What we can say is that someone chose this specific point on the rim with its specific view of the canyon and the surrounding landscape, and decided that it was worth building something here. That choice was not random. That choice was made by a person who understood this landscape with a depth and a specificity that we can barely imagine. Who knew this point on the rim not as a viewpoint, but as a place? A specific place with a specific character and a specific significance in the larger order of things. And standing there today, looking out at the same canyon, you can feel something of that significance. The canyon does not explain itself, it simply is, and in its simply being it asks a question that no answer can fully satisfy. The Painted Desert. The name was given by a Spanish expedition in 1540, and for once the Spanish named something accurately. The Painted Desert of northeastern Arizona, extending roughly from the Grand Canyon southeast to the Petrified Forest, is a landscape of color so varied and so vivid that it seems, at certain times of day, almost painted. The colors come from the exposed sedimentary layers of the Chinle Formation, mudstones and siltstones deposited during the Triassic period, the same period that produced the petrified logs of the Petrified Forest. Different minerals in different layers produce different colors. Iron oxides give reds and oranges. Manganese compounds give purples and blues. White and grey layers are relatively mineral poor, and the shifting light of the desert day transforms these colors continuously, so that a landscape that is deep red at noon is purple at dusk and almost grey in the blue light before dawn. The ancient peoples who lived in and around the Painted Desert had a relationship with this color that we can barely reconstruct. It was not simply aesthetic. Color in the cosmological systems of the ancient Southwest was meaningful. Directions were associated with colors, seasons were associated with colors. Different kinds of spiritual power were associated with different colors. The visual landscape was not just beautiful, it was communicative. It spoke in a language built from long tradition and accumulated meaning to those who knew how to read it. Standing in the Painted Desert, the ancient inhabitants were standing in a landscape that was constantly making statements in the language of colour, statements about directions and seasons and the powers that governed the world. We cannot hear those statements anymore. We see the colours, we appreciate their beauty. But the specific meanings they carried, the specific things they communicated to the people who lived here, are part of the great silence that separates us from the ancient world. The desert speaks. We simply cannot understand what it is saying. The ancestral Puebloans built in many places across the Colorado Plateau, Cañon de Chelly, Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, the Wupatki area north of Flagstaff, the Kayenta region, dozens of other sites, large and small, scattered across the vast canyon country of the Four Corners region. But among all of these, one complex of sites stands out for its sheer scale and its enduring mystery. Chaco Canyon, in what is now northwestern New Mexico, but closely connected to the broader Arizona tradition, was between approximately 850 and 1150 C, the center of something that archaeologists have struggled to define. Not a city in the modern sense, not a state in the political sense, something more ambiguous and more interesting, a hub, a center of ceremony and trade and architectural ambition that drew people and resources from across a region hundreds of miles in diameter. The great houses of Chaco Canyon are the most imposing buildings in ancient North America. Pueblo Bonito, the largest, contained perhaps 600 rooms arranged in a D-shaped plan up to 4 stories high, its curved back wall following the arc of the canyon cliff. It was built over a period of approximately 200 years, the construction proceeding in carefully planned stages that required sophisticated organization and sustained labor investment across many generations. The rooms of Pueblo Bonito were not all domestic. Many appear to have been used for storage. Others show evidence of ceremonial use. The great kivas at the site, some of the largest ever built, could accommodate hundreds of people in their ceremonies. The roads of Chaco are another mystery. Extending outward from the canyon in multiple directions, straight as arrows, ignoring topography in a way that required significant engineering effort, the Chacan roads connect the canyon to outlying communities across the region. Some extend for many miles across the desert. They are 30 feet wide, their surfaces prepared, bordered by low stone berms. Why so wide? A path adequate for foot traffic, which was the only traffic the Chacan roads ever carried, needs to be only a few feet wide. 30 feet is ceremonially wide, processionally wide enough for a large group of people to walk abreast, which suggests that the roads were used not primarily for practical transport, but for something more ritual in nature. Pilgrimage routes, perhaps, ways by which people from the outlying communities made their way to the ceremonial center at Chaco for the great gatherings that the great kivas seem to have been built to accommodate. The astronomical alignments of Chaco are among the most sophisticated in ancient North America. Buildings aligned to the cardinal directions, windows positioned to admit a shaft of light that falls on a specific wall, marking at the solstices and equinoxes. A great house positioned so that its corners align to the directions of the lunar standstill cycle, an astronomical event that repeats every 18.5 years. This last alignment is particularly striking. The lunar standstill cycle is a subtle astronomical phenomenon, the northernmost and southernmost positions of the moonrise and moonset on the horizon reaching their extremes and then slowly reversing over a period of 18.5 years. To recognize this cycle requires sustained, careful, multi-generational observation of the moon's behavior. The Chacoan builders recognized it. They incorporated it into the orientation of their most important building. They were not simple people. They were not people living in darkness, ignorant of the world around them. They were careful observers of the cosmos, builders of extraordinary ambition and skill, organizers of social systems capable of sustaining century-long building projects. And they left behind a canyon full of questions. What was Chaco? A religious center, a political capital, a marketplace, a place of pilgrimage, all of these things simultaneously. The debate continues, and the canyon, as canyons do, remains silent. The night deepens. Somewhere in the desert of Arizona, a great horned owl is calling from a saguaro cactus. The single resonant note, repeated at intervals, carries across the still air for miles. It has been carrying across the still air of Arizona deserts for millions of years, this call. The great horned owl is one of the most ancient of the surviving bird lineages, its basic form established long before the landscapes it now inhabits existed in anything like their current form. The ancient peoples of Arizona heard this call. It meant different things in different traditions. In some, the owl was a messenger of death. In others, a watcher, a guardian of the night. In others still, a being of great power, to be respected and acknowledged, but not feared. Whatever it meant, it was noticed. The ancient peoples of Arizona were extraordinarily attentive to the natural world. They had to be. Their survival depended on it. The calls of birds, the behavior of animals, the appearance of the sky, the smell of the wind, all of these were sources of information about the state of the world, signs that a practiced reader could interpret. The owl calling from the saguaro at this hour of the night was saying something. We have lost the ability to hear what it was saying, but the owl is still calling, and on some level, in some part of the nervous system that is older than language, older than culture, older than the specifically human way of being in the world, we still respond to that call. Not with the specific understanding that the ancient peoples of Arizona brought to it, but with something, a quickening of attention, a slight pause in the flow of thought, a moment of stillness that the call demands. The owl is still saying something. We simply do not know what. The Sinagua, another of the ancient peoples of Arizona, their name given to them by archaeologists who noted that their territory lay in a region of volcanic soil that was, paradoxically, farmed without irrigation. Sinagua means without water, in Spanish a name chosen for the landscape rather than the people, who of course had a name for themselves that we do not know. The Sinagua occupied a region of north-central Arizona, centered on the area around what is now Flagstaff, from roughly 500 CE to approximately 1425 CE. Their territory was bisected by the Mogollon Rim, that dramatic escarpment where the Colorado Plateau drops abruptly to the lower desert country of central Arizona and straddled the ecological zones on either side. They are perhaps best known for the site called Montezuma Castle. The name is a misnomer on 2 counts. It has nothing to do with the Aztec Emperor Montezuma, who lived centuries later and hundreds of miles to the south, and it is not really a castle. It is a cliff dwelling built into a natural alcove in the face of a limestone cliff above Beaver Creek, a tributary of the Verde River. But it is extraordinary. 20 rooms, arranged in 5 stories, built into an alcove that sits 90 feet above the canyon floor. Its walls of limestone blocks and mortar rise so precisely to fill the natural overhang above that the junction between human construction and natural rock is difficult to see. The structure fits its alcove the way a hand fits a glove. The builders understood their site with a thoroughness that speaks of long familiarity and deep knowledge. The dwelling was occupied from approximately 1100 to 1425 CE. 300 years of continuous habitation in this cliff. Generations of people who knew every crack in the limestone, every draught in the alcove, every way the light fell through the doorways at different seasons of the year. Access was by ladder. The original ladders are long gone, but the wear on the rock at the base of the cliff face shows where they were placed. The daily routine of the people who lived here included climbing and descending those ladders multiple times, a matter of course, as ordinary to them as climbing stairs is to us. Children were born in those rooms. Old people died in them. The whole span of human life took place 90 feet above the canyon floor, sheltered by the limestone overhang, looking out over the cottonwood trees and the clear running water of Beaver Creek. Why here? Again, the same question that the cliff dwellings always ask, and again the same partial answers. Defense, shelter, the thermal properties of the south-facing alcove, the reliable water of the creek below, the agricultural land in the canyon bottom, but also, surely, something more, something about this specific place, this specific cliff, this specific view. The people who chose to build here made that choice deliberately, and they stayed. 300 years is not a temporary expedient. 300 years is a home, a deep and lasting attachment to a specific place. That attachment was real, even if we cannot fully explain it. The Verde Valley in which Montezuma Castle sits was one of the most fertile and well-watered landscapes in ancient Arizona. The Verde River and its tributaries provided reliable water in a region that was otherwise challenging for agriculture. The bottomlands were rich. The surrounding hills and mesas provided building stone and hunting grounds and the plant resources that supplemented the farming. The Sinagua were not the only people who wanted this valley. Archaeological evidence shows a complex sequence of occupation in the Verde Valley, with different cultural traditions following each other and sometimes overlapping, each leaving its mark on the landscape before moving on or being absorbed into the next group. The Hohokam presence is visible in the ball courts found at some Verde Valley sites, that connection to the Sonoran desert world and the Mesoamerican traditions it carried. The ancestral Puebloan influence is visible in the architecture, the multi-story stone buildings and the kiva-like ceremonial structures. The Sinagua themselves drew from both traditions, creating something that was distinctly their own. This mixing, this cultural borrowing and adaptation, is one of the persistent features of the ancient Southwest. The region was not divided into rigidly distinct cultures, each sealed off from the others, each developing in isolation. It was a landscape of movement and contact and exchange, where ideas and techniques and people moved across boundaries that were permeable and shifting. The ancient Southwest was cosmopolitan, not in the modern sense of a city full of diverse populations living side by side, but in the deeper sense of a region full of diverse cultural traditions in conversation with each other, each borrowing from the others, each contributing to the larger cultural world of which it was a part. The ball courts that appear in Sinagua sites in northern Arizona came from the Mesoamerican traditions carried by the Hohokam from the south. The kiva-like structures came from the ancestral Puebloan traditions of the north and east. The specific character of Sinagua culture, its particular pottery styles and its specific architectural forms, emerged from the synthesis. Every culture is a synthesis. Every tradition is the result of contact and borrowing and transformation over time. The Sinagua make this visible in an unusually clear way, but they are not unique. They are simply a particularly legible example of the universal process by which human cultures develop. The San Francisco peaks rise above Flagstaff to a height of nearly 12,000 feet, the highest points in Arizona. They are the remnants of an ancient stratovolcano. Its summit collapsed after a major eruption, leaving a cluster of distinct peaks surrounding a central depression. The landscape around them for tens of miles is covered with the volcanic rock and cinders of their eruptions over the past 2 million years. The most recent significant eruption in the area occurred approximately 900 years ago, around 1085 CE, when a volcanic vent several miles east of the peaks erupted and created a cinder cone and a lava flow that covers some 800 square miles of the surrounding desert. That eruption happened while people were living in the area, but an older understanding in which human beings are not merely observers of the natural world, but participants in it, whose actions have consequences not just in the social world, but in the natural one. That understanding produced the ceremonial traditions that have maintained themselves for centuries on the Hopi mesas. And it is, in its own way, a kind of science, a science of relationship, of attentiveness, of the recognition that how you live in the world matters to the world itself. The Colorado River runs through the Grand Canyon at the bottom of the world, reached only by the long descent of the Bright Angel Trail or the equally long descent of other canyon routes, or by rafting the river from upstream. The canyon bottom is a world apart from the rim above. The temperature is different, the vegetation is different. The quality of the air, heavy and still in summer, is entirely different from the clear, dry air of the rim, and the river itself. The Colorado, in its natural state before the dams that now regulate its flow, was a river of extremes. In spring, fed by the melting snowpack of the Rocky Mountains, it ran red and powerful, carrying enormous loads of sediment, its current strong enough to move boulders. In late summer and fall it ran lower and clearer, its character gentler. The ancient peoples of the canyon lived with both of these rivers. They farmed the terraces above the floodplain, planting their crops at the right season to take advantage of the water and the fertile soil deposited by the spring floods without being inundated by them. They fished. They gathered the plants of the canyon bottom, the different ecology of the inner canyon offering resources not available on the rim above, and they traveled the river. Not the way modern rafters travel it, with specialized equipment and detailed knowledge of every rapid, but in their own way, crossing it on rafts of bundled reeds, following its course through the canyon on routes that required intimate knowledge of where the water was and was not passable. The Grand Canyon is not impassable. It is only passable if you know how. The ancient peoples of Arizona knew how, and in their knowing they inhabited a landscape that most people, then as now, never penetrated. The inner canyon was their world, remote from the rim world above, different in every physical quality, but home. And the river, that ancient river so much older than any human presence in the canyon, was the center of that home. The presence that organized everything else, the source of water and food and the rhythmic certainty of its seasonal cycles. The river is still there, diminished now by the dams upstream, its natural floods replaced by regulated flows, its sediment load reduced to a fraction of what it once carried, changed in ways that the ancient peoples of the canyon would not recognize, but still flowing, still cutting slowly through the ancient rock, still moving grain by grain toward the sea. In the Sonoran Desert of southern Arizona, where the saguaro cactus stands tall against the afternoon sky and the heat of summer can reach 115 degrees, there is a ruin that most people have never heard of. It is called Casa Grande. The name means great house in Spanish, and for once the name is fitting. Casa Grande is the largest prehistoric structure in North America north of Mexico. A 4-story earthen building, its walls made of caliche, that hardened calcium carbonate layer that occurs naturally in desert soils, its rooms arranged around a central great hall. It was built by the Hohokam sometime around 1350 CE, in the last century of their civilization's existence. And it was built with a precision that, when you examine it carefully, becomes genuinely astonishing. The walls of Casa Grande were constructed with a mixture of caliche and water, poured in successive layers and allowed to dry, a technique similar to rammed earth construction. Each layer was pressed and smoothed before the next was added. The resulting walls are hard as concrete, and in many places they have survived 800 years of Arizona weather with their structural integrity essentially intact. The building contains holes. Not accidental holes, not the erosion of damaged walls. Deliberate holes, positioned with apparent care in specific walls, holes that look out at specific points on the horizon. Holes that, researchers have found, allow a shaft of light to enter the building and fall on a specific interior surface at specific times of year. At the summer solstice, a beam of light enters through a hole in the east wall and passes through a hole in the west wall on the opposite side of the room. At the spring and fall equinoxes, light enters through different holes and illuminates different surfaces. Casa Grande was, among other things, an astronomical observatory, a building that tracked the movements of the sun through the year in a way that provided precise information about the timing of the agricultural seasons. The people who built it knew where the sun would be on specific days with a precision that allowed them to engineer these light effects into a massive earth building. They were not guessing. They had accumulated the astronomical knowledge required over generations of careful observation, and they had translated that knowledge into architecture with a skill that still impresses modern engineers. And they were gone within 100 years of building it. Casa Grande was abandoned around 1450 CE, along with the rest of the Hohokam Canal system. The great house sat empty in the desert, its upper stories gradually collapsing, its caliche walls slowly eroding in the occasional rains. When the first Spanish explorers encountered it in the late 17th century, they found a ruin. Something whose purpose they could not guess, whose builders were unknown, whose age was unimaginable. They called it Casa Grande and moved on. Tucson, the second largest city in Arizona, sits in the Sonoran Desert at the base of a ring of mountain ranges that rise dramatically from the desert floor. The Santa Catalina Mountains to the north, the Rincon Mountains to the east, the Santa Rita Mountains to the south, the Tucson Mountains to the west. In the narrow passes through these mountains and in the valleys between them, and in the broad desert basin at their center, human beings have been living for at least 12,000 years. 12,000 years? The earliest evidence of human presence in the Tucson Basin comes from Paleo-Indian sites along the Santa Cruz River, which once ran year-round through the basin, fed by the same kind of aquifer springs that fed the hill country rivers of Texas. The river is largely dry today, its water table depleted by the pumping of a rapidly growing city. But 12,000 years ago, it ran clear and reliable, and the grasslands along its banks were rich with game. The Clovis hunters came here. Their points have been found at sites along the ancient riverbank. Then the archaic peoples adapting to the post-Ice Age climate as the megafauna disappeared and the desert spread. Learning to live from the desert's own resources, to read its rhythms and take what it offered. Then the Hohokam, bringing their canals and their ball courts, and their red-on-buff pottery, and their connections to the wider world of the ancient Southwest and the civilizations of Mesoamerica. Then, after the Hohokam, the O'odham, the Tohono O'odham, the desert people, whose name for themselves means what it means, people of the desert, not people in the desert, but people of it, defined by it, formed by it, belonging to it in the deepest sense of belonging. The Tohono O'odham have been living in the Sonoran Desert for a very long time. How long is debated, but their deep knowledge of the desert and their highly specialized adaptation to its rhythms suggests a relationship that goes back many generations before the historical record begins. Their traditional way of life was organized around the desert's seasonal rhythms in ways that required intimate, encyclopedic knowledge of the landscape. In spring, the desert blooms. The rains of winter have charged the soil with moisture and the temperatures are warm. Plants grow quickly, flowering and setting seed before the summer heat arrives. The Tohono O'odham moved through the desert at this season, harvesting the green shoots of desert plants, hunting the animals that were active in the cooler spring weather. In summer, the heat was intense but not entirely hostile, because the summer monsoon rains brought a second season of growth. The saguaro cactus, that defining symbol of the Sonoran Desert, ripens its fruit in June and July, just as the monsoon season begins. The fruit is sweet and rich in sugar and was an important food source, harvested with long poles made from the dried ribs of dead saguaros. The Tohono O'odham fermented the saguaro fruit into a ceremonial wine, used in a rain ceremony that was believed to call the monsoon rains. The ceremony was not merely symbolic, it was, in the Tohono O'odham understanding, a genuine intervention in the natural processes that governed rainfall. The people had a role to play in the coming of the rains. The proper performance of their ceremonies was part of the system that made the rains arrive. This understanding placed the Tohono O'odham in a relationship with the desert that was not that of tenants in a landscape they did not control. It was the relationship of participants in a living system whose maintenance required their active involvement. The saguaro fruit is still harvested by the Tohono O'odham today. The rain ceremony is still performed. The relationship continues. 12,000 years after the first humans arrived in the Tucson Basin, people are still here, still in relationship with this desert, still learning from it, still belonging to it. The Sky Island mountain ranges of southeastern Arizona are one of the most extraordinary ecological phenomena in North America. The ranges rise from the Sonoran Desert floor to heights of 9,000, 10,000 feet above sea level. The desert at their base gives way as you climb to grassland, and then to oak woodland, and then to pine forest, and then to spruce and fir at the highest elevations. The ecological zones that occur from the Sonoran Desert to the Canadian boreal forest, normally separated by thousands of miles of latitude, are compressed into a vertical distance of a few thousand feet. The mountain ranges are islands in a desert sea. Species that require the cooler, wetter conditions of higher elevations live on these mountains, surrounded by the desert they cannot cross. They evolved in isolation from the populations of the same species on other mountain ranges, developing their own distinctive characteristics over thousands of generations. And the ancient peoples of the region understood this, not in the scientific terms of evolutionary biology, but in the practical terms of people who needed to know where to find specific resources in different seasons. In summer, when the desert below was brutally hot, the mountain ranges offered relief. The Tohono O'odham and their predecessors moved upslope in summer, accessing the cooler forests and the reliable streams of the high country. They hunted deer that spent the summer on the mountain slopes. They gathered the acorns of the madrian oaks, those distinctive trees of the upper desert grassland that produce small, sweet acorns in good years. In winter, they moved down. The mountain peaks were cold and snowy, inhospitable to people without the technology for winter camping in deep snow. But the desert below was mild, and the winter ripening plants of the lower desert provided food through the cool months. This seasonal movement up in summer and down in winter was not random wandering. It was a carefully organized annual cycle, timed to the availability of specific resources in specific locations, requiring intimate knowledge of a landscape that spanned thousands of feet of elevation and dozens of ecological communities. The ancient peoples of southeastern Arizona were not just desert dwellers. They were mountain dwellers and grassland dwellers and oak woodland dwellers. They moved through all of these environments across the year, maintaining a relationship with each that required deep knowledge of each. This knowledge is one of the most valuable and least accessible forms of human understanding of the Arizona landscape. It is still held in part by the communities whose ancestors developed it, and it is still in part being lost. Each generation that lives more of its life in the city and less of it in the desert, each generation that learns more from screens and less from elders, carries slightly less of the old knowledge forward. This is not unique to to Arizona, it is happening everywhere as the accumulated ecological knowledge of thousands of years of intimate human relationship with specific landscapes is gradually displaced by the global, homogeneous knowledge of the modern world. What is lost in that displacement is not just information, it is a way of being in the world, a way of paying attention, a way of belonging to a specific place. And in its loss, the desert becomes a little more silent, a little less known. There is a canyon in the Chiricahua Mountains of southeastern Arizona that very few people ever visit. It has no famous ruins, no dramatic rock art, no archaeological site that appears in the textbooks, but it has something that many of the famous sites do not: presence. The canyon is narrow, its walls of volcanic rock rising steeply on both sides. A small stream runs along its floor, fed by springs in the mountains above. The vegetation along the stream is lush, incongruously green in the dry, brown landscape of the surrounding mountains. Sycamores and cottonwoods, their roots reaching deep to the perennial water, arch over the stream in a canopy that filters the sunlight into something softer and greener than the harsh Arizona sun. In this canyon, the Apache lived, not the Lipan Apache of Texas, but the Chiricahua Apache, the band whose territory was these southeastern Arizona mountains and the surrounding desert, whose leaders in the 19th century became the most famous of all the Apache resistance fighters: Cochise, Geronimo. But before the 19th century, before the resistance and the wars and the long tragedy that followed, the Chiricahua Apache lived in these mountains in a way that was ancient and sustaining and deeply intelligent. They knew the Chiricahuas with the intimacy that comes from generations of living in a specific place. Every spring, every game trail, every plant that provided food or medicine or material for the objects they needed. They moved through the mountains with a freedom and a knowledge that no outsider could match. The canyons and the peaks that seemed forbidding and trackless to the soldiers sent to pursue them were to the Chiricahua home territory, known in every detail. That knowledge was the source of their military effectiveness, not superior weapons, not greater numbers, but superior knowledge of the ground. The Apache wars of the 19th century were, among other things, a contest between two kinds of knowledge: the formal, map-based knowledge of the United States Army, which knew the territory in the abstract, and the intimate, embodied knowledge of the Chiricahua Apache, who knew it from the inside. The Army had maps. The Apache had knowledge. For a long time, knowledge won. And the canyons of the Chiricahua Mountains, those cool, stream-fed places where the Apache made their camps and raised their children and maintained their ceremonies, still carry something of that knowledge in their character. The stream still runs. The sycamores still arch overhead. The mountains still rise above, their profiles known to every Apache child who grew up in their shadow. And in the quality of the silence in those canyons, there is something of the people who once made them home, the desert at night. This is perhaps the best-kept secret of the Arizona landscape, the thing that visitors who come only in daylight miss entirely. The Sonoran Desert at night, in the cool hours between midnight and dawn, is a place of extraordinary life. The animals that rest through the brutal day emerge in the darkness. The javelinas move in their family groups through the prickly pear. The coyotes call across the desert, their voices carrying impossible distances in the still air. The ringtail cats, those beautiful nocturnal hunters pick their way across the rocks on feet as precise as a dancer's. The elf owls, the smallest owls in the world, call from their nesting holes in the saguaros, and the insects. The Sonoran desert at night is loud with insects, the crickets, and the katydids, and the cicadas, and dozens of other species, each producing its own specific sound. The combined effect, a sustained, complex, layered music that fills the darkness from the ground to the canopy of the sky. The ancient peoples of Arizona heard this music every night. It was not background noise to them, it was information. The calls of specific insects and the calls of specific frogs told them about the moisture in the air, the approach of rain, the state of the water sources in the surrounding desert. The behavior of nocturnal animals spoke about the conditions of the desert in ways that a practiced listener could interpret. The night was not blank. The night was full, and the ancient peoples of Arizona were fully present in it, attentive to it, reading it with the same care and skill that they brought to the day. The darkness was not something to be shut out. It was part of the world, part of the experience of being alive in this place, and it offered its own gifts, the coolness after the brutal day, the softening of the hard edges of the desert landscape in the moonlight, the extraordinary stars blazing above with an intensity that the bright desert days never suggest, and the quiet. Not the silence of absence, the quiet of fullness. The desert at night is full of sound, full of life, full of movement. But it is also, beneath all of that, deeply, essentially quiet. The kind of quiet that goes all the way down. The kind of quiet that the ancient peoples of Arizona knew how to inhabit, that we are still learning to find. The morning comes to the Arizona desert slowly. Not the dramatic sunrise of other landscapes, not the sudden illumination of a sky that was dark a moment before, but a slow, gradual brightening in the east, the stars fading one by one, as the sky goes from black to deep blue, to the particular shade of grey that precedes the first colour, then colour. First at the horizon a thin line of orange and gold, where the sun is still below the edge of the earth, then spreading upward slowly, transforming the grey sky above. The mountains catch the light first, their peaks turning golden while their lower slopes are still in darkness. Then the light moves down the mountain faces, revealing them in their full complexity, the canyons and ridges and rock faces that the night had hidden. And finally, the desert floor, the saguaros casting their long morning shadows westward, the prickly pear glowing briefly golden before the sun rises high enough to make the light harsh. The creosote bushes, those ancient, virtually immortal shrubs that may live for thousands of years, releasing their characteristic smell in the first warmth of the morning sun. It is the same morning that the ancient peoples of Arizona woke to. The same sequence of light, the same mountains catching the sunrise, the same smell of creosote in the warming air. And if you are awake early enough, in the right place, far enough from the cities that the night is genuinely dark, you can experience something of what they experienced, not everything. You cannot experience the world without the knowledge they had, without the relationships they maintained with the landscape and with each other. You cannot experience the fullness of a life embedded in this desert across generations, but something. The quality of the morning light on the mountains, the smell of the desert waking, the gradual revelation of a landscape that held its mysteries through the night and offers them again in the morning. These things have not changed. The desert is still here, the mountains are still here, the morning is still here. And whatever the ancient peoples of Arizona found in this morning light, whatever quality of the world they recognized in it, some part of that is still available, if you know how to be still enough to receive it. We are coming to the end of our long journey through the mysteries of ancient Arizona. We have traveled far tonight, from the incomprehensible depth of the Grand Canyon to the cliff dwellings of Canyon de Chelly, from the canal systems of the Hohokam to the star-aligned chambers of Casa Grande, from the volcanic landscape of Wupatki to the Sky Island mountains of the southeast, from the Hopi mesas where 1,000 years of continuous ceremony has maintained the relationship between the human world and the powers that govern it, to the quiet canyons of the Chiricahua Mountains where the Apache once moved with a knowledge so intimate it was almost indistinguishable from instinct. Ancient Arizona is not a collection of ruins. It is a living landscape, still inhabited by the descendants of the people who made it what it is, still carrying in its rock and soil and water the memory of everything that has happened here. The ruins are not the story. They are the punctuation marks, the visible evidence of a story that goes much deeper and extends much further than any single site or any single culture can represent. The story is the land itself, the Colorado Plateau, ancient beyond reckoning, the Sonoran Desert, deceptively harsh, deeply abundant, the mountain ranges, those sky islands rising from the desert, their forests as remote from the desert below as different worlds. And through all of it, the water, or the absence of water. In a desert landscape, water is not just a resource. It is the organizing principle of everything. Where the water is determines where life is, where people can live, what people can build. The entire human history of Arizona is, in a very real sense, a story about water, about how different peoples in different periods found different ways to secure enough water to sustain themselves in a landscape where water was never certain. The Hohokam and their canals, the ancestral Puebloans and their careful positioning in alcoves near reliable springs, the Tohono O'odham and their intimate knowledge of where the desert's hidden water could be found, the Apache and their mastery of a terrain where water holes were the key to everything. Different solutions, same problem, across 15,000 years, and today the water problem has not gone away, it has only grown larger. The cities of Arizona, Phoenix, and Tucson and their surrounding communities depend on the Colorado River and the groundwater of ancient aquifers for their survival. The Colorado River is over-allocated, promised to more users than it can serve. The aquifers are being depleted faster than they recharge. The water crisis that ended the Hohokam civilization 1,400 years ago is still, in a different form, present. The ancient peoples of Arizona could not solve it permanently. Neither have we. And in that shared predicament, perhaps, there is something like solidarity across the millennia. We are all, in the end, people trying to live in a desert, trying to find enough water, trying to build something that will last. The ancient Arizonans did not entirely succeed, neither will we entirely. But the trying matters, the building matters, the knowledge accumulated in the trying and the building, the knowledge of how to live in relationship with a difficult landscape, that knowledge matters most of all. Some of it has been lost. Some of it is still here, and some of it, perhaps, is still waiting to be found. The desert is very quiet now. The night has done its work. The questions we have been carrying through these hours of ancient history have softened, as questions do when they have been held long enough without demanding answers. The Grand Canyon is still there. A mile deep and 277 miles long, it does not require our awareness to exist. It simply is, as it has been for 5 million years, as it will be for millions more. The White House ruin is still there in its alcove 90 feet above the floor of Canyon de Shelly. Its plaster still white where the overhang has protected it from the rain. Its doorways still opening onto the same view of the canyon that the people who built them saw every morning for 300 years. The saguaros of the Sonoran Desert are still there, their arms raised in that unmistakable silhouette against whatever sky exists above them tonight. The oldest of them may have been alive for 200 years. They have lived through everything. The disappearance of the Hohokam, the arrival of the Spanish, the coming of the Americans, all of it. And they are still here, still growing their slow growth, still hosting their elf owls and their cactus wrens, and their colonies of bats that drink the nectar of their flowers on warm spring nights. The Hopi mesas are still there, their villages still occupied, their ceremonies still maintained, the smoke of their fires still rising into the Arizona sky in the cool hours of the morning. These things do not require our understanding. They do not require our presence. They exist in their own right, on their own terms, in their own time. And we are fortunate to be alive in the same moment they are. Fortunate to be able to reach backward through the centuries, through the layers of time, and feel something of the presence of the people who built these places and lived in them and loved them and left them. That feeling, that reaching, is one of the most distinctly human things we do. We are the creatures who remember, who carry the past in our minds, who feel the weight of what has been even as we live in what is. And tonight, you have carried some of that weight, the weight of ancient Arizona, the weight of 15,000 years of human presence in one of the most extraordinary landscapes on Earth. You have been a good witness to it. Now let it go. Let the weight of it settle gently into the earth beneath you, where it belongs, where all the ancient things belong, where the mammoths and the Clovis hunters and the Hohokam engineers and the cliff-dwelling builders and the Hopi ceremonialists and the Apache warriors have all already gone, into the earth, into the long rest that waits at the end of every journey. You are still here. Still breathing, still warm. The ancient desert is all around you, even if you cannot see it from where you lie. And it is patient, patient in the way that only things with a very long history can be patient. It has been here for 2 billion years. It can wait for you to sleep. Let your eyes stay closed. Let your breathing slow. Let the long, warm, ancient dark of the Arizona night hold you, as it has held everyone who has ever rested in its embrace, as it holds you now. Sleep, sleep well, sleep deep. The ancient mysteries will still be there in the morning. They have waited 15,000 years. They can wait until you wake. The wind in Arizona moves differently than wind anywhere else. In the coastal places of the world, the wind carries moisture. You can feel it on your skin, a softness, a slight weight that speaks of the ocean somewhere not too far away. In the forested places of the east, the wind moves through leaves and carries the smell of green things, of chlorophyll and soil and the quiet work of trees going about their slow business. But in Arizona, the wind carries dryness. It moves across the desert floor and picks up what the desert offers: dust, fine red particles of eroded sandstone, the dry, almost medicinal smell of the creosote bush, the faint mineral scent of heated rock, releasing what little moisture it holds as the day cools toward evening. This wind was the constant companion of every person who ever lived in Arizona. The ancient Hohokam farmers standing in their irrigated fields felt it. The same wind, carrying the same dryness, tugging at whatever they wore and drying the sweat from their skin before it could cool them properly. The cliff dwellers of Canyon de Chelly felt it funneling through the canyon, swirling at the base of the great sandstone walls, carrying voices from the village below up to the alcoves where they lived. The Hopi farmers on their mesas felt it as it always blows there, steady and relentless from the southwest, the wind that dries everything it touches and makes the high mesa country feel even more exposed, more offered up to the sky than the landscape below. The ancient Arizonans understood wind not just as a meteorological phenomenon, as a presence, a living force with its own character and its own moods and its own relationship to the other forces that governed the world. In many southwestern traditions, the wind is not simply moving air, it is breath, the breath of the world itself. And breath in most indigenous American cosmologies is not just a biological function. It is the medium of life, the thing that connects the living to the living force that animates them. To breathe is to participate in the world's breathing. Every breath the ancient Arizonans took was the same air that moved across the desert and through the canyons and over the high peaks. The same air that carried the seeds of the desert plants and the sounds of the desert birds. The same air that connected their bodies to the landscape around them in the most intimate possible way. We breathe that air too. Not the same specific molecules, obviously. Those have dispersed across the planet in the years since the Hohokam farmed and the cliff dwellers climbed their ladders. But the same quality of air, the same desert dryness, the same faint mineral smell on a hot afternoon, the same connection. Every breath is a participation in the world. The ancient Arizonans knew this, and in the quiet of the night, in the hours when the breathing slows and deepens, and the body does its essential work, that participation continues. You are breathing now. Slowly, deeply, without effort, the same breath that has moved through every living body in every landscape since life began to breathe. Let it come in. Let it go. Let the breathing be all there is for a little while. The Mogollon people are among the least known of the ancient southwestern cultures and among the most interesting. Their territory occupied the mountains and high plateaus of eastern Arizona and western New Mexico, centered on the Mogollon Rim, that great escarpment where the Colorado Plateau drops away to the lower country of central Arizona. It is a landscape of striking contrast, forested mountains above and desert below, rivers cutting through canyons, whose walls expose the geological layers of the plateau. The Mogollon occupied this territory from roughly 200 CE to approximately 1450 CE. Their culture went through several distinct phases, each building on what came before, each adapting to the changing conditions of the landscape and the evolving relationships with neighboring cultures. The earliest Mogollon were semi-nomadic, moving through the mountain landscape in seasonal patterns that took advantage of the different resources available at different elevations and at different times of year. They built pit houses, those semi-subterranean structures that provided natural insulation against both the mountain cold of winter and the summer heat. They made pottery. The earliest Mogollon pottery is simple, brown ware, its surface undecorated or bearing only the marks of its manufacture. But the Mogollon pottery tradition evolved across the centuries into something extraordinary. The ancient Arizonans understood wind, not just as a meteorological phenomenon, as a presence, a living force with its own character and its own moods and its own relationship to the other forces that governed the world. In many southwestern traditions, the wind is not simply moving air. It is breath, the breath of the world itself. And breath, in most indigenous American cosmologies, is not just a biological function. It is the medium of life, the thing that connects the living to the living force that animates them. To breathe is to participate in the world's breathing. Every breath the ancient Arizonans took was the same air that moved across the desert and through the canyons and over the high peaks. The same air that carried the seeds of the desert plants and the sounds of the desert birds, the same air that connected their bodies to the landscape around them in the most intimate possible way. We breathe that air too, not the same specific molecules, obviously. Those have dispersed across the planet in the years since the Hohokam farmed and the cliff dwellers climbed their ladders. But the same quality of air, the same desert dryness, the same faint mineral smell on a hot afternoon, the same connection. Every breath is a participation in the world. The ancient Arizonans knew this, and in the quiet of the night, in the hours when the breathing slows and deepens, and the body does its essential work, that participation continues. You are breathing now, slowly, deeply, without effort. The same breath that has moved through every living body in every landscape since life began to breathe. Let it come in, let it go. Let the breathing be all there is for a little while. The Mogollon people are among the least known of the ancient southwestern cultures and among the most interesting. Their territory occupied the mountains and high plateaus of eastern Arizona and western New Mexico. Centered on the Mogollon Rim, that great escarpment where the Colorado Plateau drops away to the lower country of central Arizona. It is a landscape of striking contrast, forested mountains above and desert below, rivers cutting through canyons whose walls expose the geological layers of the plateau. The Mogollon occupied this territory from roughly 200 CE to approximately 1450 CE. Their culture went through several distinct phases, each building on what came before, each adapting to the changing conditions of the landscape and the evolving relationships with neighboring cultures. The earliest Mogollon were semi-nomadic, moving through the mountain landscape in seasonal patterns that took advantage of the different resources available at different elevations and at different times of year. They built pit houses, those semi-subterranean structures that provided natural insulation against both the mountain cold of winter and the summer heat. They made pottery. The earliest Mogollon pottery is simple, brown ware, its surface undecorated or bearing only the marks of its manufacture. But the Mogollon pottery tradition evolved across the centuries into something extraordinary. The Mimbres pottery of the classic Mimbres period between approximately 1000 and 1130 CE is among the most remarkable ceramic art produced by any culture in the ancient world. The Mimbres people lived along the Mimbres River in southwestern New Mexico, in the heart of Mogolon territory. Their pottery is black and white, the white slip painted with black geometric designs and figurative images of extraordinary sophistication. Animals, human figures, mythological scenes, geometric patterns that achieve a complexity and a precision that seems almost impossible given the tools available. But it is not the technical quality of the Mimbres pottery that is most remarkable. It is the imagery. The animals on Mimbres pottery are depicted with a keen observational accuracy that speaks of intimate, sustained familiarity. Fish, rendered with the specific characteristics of particular species, their scales and fins and the shape of their mouths, capturing something that goes beyond generic fishness to the specific quality of a specific kind of fish that the painter had watched with close attention. Birds, insects, deer, rabbits, all depicted with the same quality of specific attention. And then the stranger images, human figures engaged in activities that are ambiguous between the everyday and the ceremonial, figures that seem to be half human and half animal, composite creatures that exist in no natural taxonomy but belong to the Mimbres' understanding of a world where the boundaries between human and animal, between the visible and the invisible, were permeable. These pots were buried with the dead, and before they were buried, they were killed. A hole was punched through the base of each pot, a deliberate act sometimes called killing the pot. The meaning of this practice has been debated extensively. Perhaps it released the spirit of the pot, allowing it to accompany the spirit of the dead person into whatever came after. Perhaps it prevented the pot from being reused, reserving it permanently for its funerary purpose. Perhaps it was something else entirely, specific to the Mimbres' understanding of the relationship between objects and persons and death. We do not know, but the image of it is powerful. A beautifully made pot, painted with extraordinary care and skill, a pot that required significant labour and significant knowledge to produce, being deliberately broken at the moment of burial, the beauty made and then unmade, the skill invested and then surrendered, as if the making itself was the point, not the object but the act of making, not the pot but the painting, not the product but the process of its creation and its giving away. There is something in that which speaks to something very old in the human understanding of art and beauty and loss. We make things, beautiful things, and then we lose them. And the making and the losing are both part of the same act, the same acknowledgement that beauty is real, and that it is temporary, and that its temporariness does not diminish it. The Mimbres potters understood this, and their pots, buried under the floors of their abandoned villages in the Mimbres Valley, found by archaeologists and now dispersed in museums and collections around the world, still speak of that understanding, still beautiful, still specific, still bearing in their painted surfaces the evidence of a mind that looked at the world with extraordinary attention and found it endlessly worth rendering. The Salt River Valley, where Phoenix now sprawls across the desert floor, was the heart of the Hohokam world. Today, it is one of the fastest growing metropolitan areas in North America, a city of nearly 5 million people rising from a desert that, without the water brought by the Salt River Project's system of dams and canals, could not support a fraction of that population. The Hohokam would understand this dependency. Their civilization was equally dependent on water brought from the rivers to the fields. The same rivers that the modern dams now control, the Salt and the Gila, were the source of the Hohokam canals. The same fundamental challenge, making enough water available to grow food in a desert, was their challenge too. The difference is scale. The Hohokam supported a population of perhaps 40 or 50,000 people in the Salt River Valley at their peak. The modern metropolitan area is nearly 100 times larger. The canals the modern engineers built follow, in many places, the exact routes of the Hohokam canals. When the developers of the modern irrigation system were planning their routes in the late 19th century, they found that the ancient engineers had already solved the problem of optimal routing through the landscape. The gradients were right, the locations were right. The ancient canals were not just a historical curiosity. They were an engineering guide, and beneath the streets and the parking lots and the foundations of the modern city, the remains of the Hohokam world still exist. Archaeologists working ahead of construction projects in Phoenix regularly uncover Hohokam sites, canal segments, pit house foundations, pottery, the material record of a civilization that occupied this valley for 1400 years before the modern city was imagined. The modern city is built on the ancient one, literally. The foundations of Phoenix rest on the foundations of Snaketown, of the great Hohokam communities of the Salt River Valley, of the civilization that solved the problem of desert farming and sustained itself here for longer than the time from the Norman conquest to today. We are the inheritors of their landscape, not of their knowledge, which is largely lost, but of the physical world they shaped, the valley they farmed, the river they channeled, the desert they transformed temporarily and with enormous effort into something that could support human civilization. That transformation was real. Its traces are everywhere if you know how to look, under the asphalt, under the foundations, under the layers of modern construction that cover the ancient desert floor. The Hohokam are still there, still present in the land they shaped, still part of the story of the place where 5 million people now live and work and sleep. There is a quality to the light in Arizona in the late afternoon that painters have always tried and mostly failed to capture. The sun, low in the west, illuminates the red rock landscapes of the north and the volcanic mountains of the central region, and the saguaro-studded plains of the south with a light that is simultaneously warm and precise. It brings out the colour in the rock in a way that the high, bright light of noon does not. The reds are redder, the oranges glow, the shadows in the canyon walls turn a deep purple that seems almost to have its own light. This is the light the ancient Arizonans knew best, the light of the working day's end, the light that announced the approach of the evening meal, of the fire, of the long conversation of the night, the light that made the familiar landscape briefly extraordinary, briefly luminous, before the dark came. They watched this light. They marked it. They incorporated it into their understanding of the day and the year. The position of the sunset on the horizon shifts through the year, moving north in summer and south in winter, and the most extreme positions, the solstices, were markers of great importance in most southwestern traditions. At the winter solstice, when the sun sets at its furthest south and the days are at their shortest, the ancient peoples of Arizona performed their most important ceremonies. Ceremonies to encourage the sun to turn back in its southward journey, to remind it that it was needed here, to express the human community's commitment to maintaining the relationship that made continued life possible. The sun always turned. Every year after the solstice, the days began to lengthen. The sun moved back toward the north, the growing season approached, the ceremonies had worked, or the sun had followed its own nature, and the ceremonies had worked in a different sense. They had maintained the community's attention, their shared understanding of the rhythms of the year, their sense of participation in the processes that govern their lives. Both things can be true at once.
The ancient Arizonans were not confused about the difference between their ceremonies and the movement of the sun. They were not simple people who thought that their prayers literally moved the stars. They were sophisticated people who understood that the relationship between human action and natural process was complex, that the maintenance of right relationship required effort, and that the ceremonies they performed were the form that effort took. This is not so different from what we do. When we mark the solstices, when we celebrate the new year, when we gather at the equinoxes to acknowledge the turning of the season, we are doing something similar. Acknowledging the rhythms of the world. Participating consciously in the passage of time. Affirming our presence in a universe that does not require our awareness but is somehow enriched by it. The ancient Arizonans were very good at this. We are still learning. The night animals are moving now. The kangaroo rat, that extraordinary small mammal of the Sonoran Desert, is hopping across the desert floor on its powerful back legs, its long tail providing balance, its enormous eyes adapted to the faintest light. It has not drunk water in weeks, perhaps months. It extracts all the moisture it needs from the seeds it eats, through a metabolic process so efficient that it can live its entire life in the desert without ever finding a free water source. The ancient peoples of Arizona knew the kangaroo rat. They ate it when they could catch it. They admired its capacity to survive in the desert's harshest conditions, a capacity they aspired to in their own way. The ability to live in the desert, to find what the desert offered and take nothing more than what was needed, was the central skill of desert life. The kangaroo rat has that skill in its DNA, refined over millions of years of evolution in precisely this landscape. The ancient peoples developed it in their culture, refined over thousands of years of living in precisely this landscape. Culture and evolution, working in parallel, both producing the same result, a way of being in the desert that was sustainable. That took what was offered without taking more. That maintained the relationship with the landscape that made continued life possible. The kangaroo rat is still here, still hopping across the desert floor in the darkness, still living by the same rules it has always lived by. The ancient peoples are gone, at least in the specific forms they took, the Hohokam, the Sinagua, the Mogollon. But their descendants are still here too. The O'odham, the Hopi, the Navajo, the Apache, the Yavapai, the many peoples who carry in their traditions and their languages and their relationships with the Arizona landscape the living legacy of the ancient world. They are still here, still maintaining, as best they can under the pressures of the modern world, the knowledge and the ceremonies and the understanding of the landscape that their ancestors developed over thousands of years. Still, in their own ways, kangaroo rats, finding what the desert offers, taking what they need, maintaining the relationship. The ruins speak if you know how to listen, not in words, not in any language that the ear can hear, but in a quality of presence that certain old places have that accumulates over centuries of human habitation and does not entirely dissipate when the habitation ends. You feel it at Casa Grande, standing in the shadow of the great caliche walls. The building knows it was built for something. The intentionality of its construction is palpable. The holes in the walls that track the sun's progress through the year are not just architectural features. They are evidence of attention, of a mind that watched the sky across many years and encoded what it learned in the walls of a building that would last after that mind was gone. You feel it at the White House ruin in Canyon de Chelly, looking up at the plaster still bright on the upper story. 300 years of habitation left something in that alcove that is not just archaeological evidence. It is a quality of having been home, of having been the center of lives. The place where children were born and old people died and the middle generation went about the work of sustaining everyone. You feel it at the Hopi Mesas, where the buildings are not ruins at all, but still inhabited, still warm with fire and cooking and the presence of people who have been here for 900 years, where the continuity is not just archaeological, but living, breathing, present in the smell of juniper smoke and the sound of voices and the sight of someone walking along a path that their ancestors walked for centuries before them. These are not just tourist sites. They are not just points of historical interest. They are places where the long human story of Arizona is most visible, most concentrated, most available to those who come to them with patience and respect. They are the text of Arizona's ancient history, and the text is still legible to those who take the time to learn to read it. In the Sonoran Desert, about 30 miles north of Tucson, there is a place called Biosphere 2. It is a modern building, a large glass and steel structure built in the late 1980s, and it has nothing to do with ancient Arizona, but it sits in the desert at the base of the Santa Catalina Mountains, surrounded by the same landscape that the ancient peoples of southern Arizona inhabited, and it was built in response to a very ancient question. The question is, how do living systems sustain themselves? How does a closed or nearly closed system of life maintain the conditions that make life possible? How do the atmosphere and the water and the soil and the living organisms that depend on all three maintain themselves in balance? What happens when that balance is disrupted? The ancient Hohokam asked this question in practical terms, though they would not have phrased it in those words. Their civilization depended on a living system, the combination of river water and desert soil and human labor remaining in balance. When the balance was disrupted, whether by drought or flooding, or soil salinization or social breakdown, the system failed. They learned, through experience, what the system needed, what it could tolerate, and what it could not. How much water the soil could receive before the salt accumulation became a problem. How to maintain the canals against the silt that the river constantly deposited. How to organize the labor required to keep the whole system functioning. They were, in their own way, practicing the science of living systems, and their civilization lasted 1400 years. That is not failure. That is extraordinary success by any historical standard. The United States is less than 300 years old. The Roman Empire, at its longest, lasted roughly 500 years. The Hohokam lasted 1400 years in a desert that should, by our modern intuitions, have been impossible to farm at all. They did something right. And what they did right, what specific knowledge and practices and social arrangements allowed them to sustain their civilization for 14 centuries, in the Sonoran Desert, is knowledge that we have not fully recovered and may never fully recover. It lies somewhere in the ruins of their canal system, in the remnants of their platform mounds, in the surviving traditions of their Oodum descendants, in the landscape itself shaped by their presence, still bearing the marks of their long occupation. And in that knowledge, wherever it lies, there is something worth looking for, something that the modern world, facing its own questions about sustainability and the long-term viability of human civilization, might find useful, if we knew how to look. If we had the patience to ask the ruins the right questions. The stars of Arizona are moving. Not really, of course. The stars are not moving. The Earth is rotating, carrying us eastward at 1,000 miles an hour, and the stars appear to move in response. The great wheel of the sky turning overhead, the stars rising in the east and setting in the west in their slow procession through the night. The ancient peoples of Arizona watched this wheel and found meaning in it. Not just the practical meaning of the calendar, the knowledge of what season was approaching and what work needed to be done, but the deeper meaning of the pattern itself, the recognition that the cosmos was orderly, that the stars moved in predictable ways, that the universe was not chaos but pattern, not randomness but rhythm. This recognition, this experience of the cosmos as something ordered and intelligible, is one of the great gifts that the night sky gives to those who watch it with attention. It is a gift that the ancient Arizonans received every clear night. And it is a gift that is still available. In the parts of Arizona that are still dark enough, far enough from the cities, the night sky still turns overhead in the same stately procession, the same stars, the same patterns, the same slow wheel of the cosmos, unchanged by anything that has happened on the surface of the earth below. The Hohokam, who watched the sky from the top of their platform mounds, saw the same sky. The cliff dwellers of Canyon de Chelly, who watched the stars from the rim above their alcoves, saw the same sky. The Hopi ceremonialists, who oriented their buildings to the movements of the sun and moon and stars, saw the same sky. And you, wherever you are tonight, are under the same sky, not visible perhaps, not dark enough where you are, or cloudy, or it is already morning. But there, the same sky, the same wheel turning, the same orderly cosmos that the ancient Arizonans recognized and built their world around. You are part of that order. You always have been. You always will be. The canyon is very dark now. In the hours before dawn, when the night is at its deepest, Canyon de Chelly exists in a darkness that is almost complete. The canyon walls rise on both sides, blocking whatever faint light might come from the sky above. The cottonwood trees along the canyon floor, their leaves rustling in whatever slight movement of air exists even in the stillest night, are invisible shapes against a slightly less invisible sky. The stream still runs. You can hear it. That small, constant sound of water moving over rock, so quiet in the canyon silence that it seems less like a sound than like the sound of silence itself. The way silence sounds when it has been listening to water for a very long time. The ancient people of Canyon de Chelly heard this stream. For 5,000 years, this same stream has been the background sound of this canyon. The same notes, more or less, varying with the season and the rainfall, but always present, always this small, continuous articulation of water moving through rock. 5,000 years of this sound, generation after generation of people falling asleep to it. And now you. Not in the canyon, almost certainly, not in any physical proximity to the actual stream that runs through the actual Canyon de Chelly, but in your own place. Your own darkness, your own background sounds, whatever they are, the sounds of the place where you are resting, and beneath all of those sounds, if you listen deeply enough, beneath the sounds of the building and the street and the wind and the other people and the distant traffic and all the sounds that make up the acoustic texture of the modern world, beneath all of it, something. A quietness, a depth, the same depth that underlies the sound of the stream in Canyon de Chelly, the same fundamental silence out of which all sounds arise and into which they all return. Rest in that depth now. Let the sounds of the surface recede. Let the depth receive you. It is very old, this depth. Older than the canyon, older than the desert, older than the rocks that the Hohokam used to build their great canal system, older than the ancient sea whose compressed remains form the limestone of southern Arizona. It has been here since before there was anything to be quiet about. And it is here, now, underneath everything, waiting for you to find it. You have found it. Rest in it now. There is nothing more to say tonight. We have traveled through 15,000 years of human presence in ancient Arizona, through the Clovis hunters who followed the mammoths into the canyon country, through the basket makers who wove their extraordinary baskets in the sheltered alcoves of Canyon de Chelly, through the ancestral Puebloans who built their cliff dwellings and their great houses and their astronomical observatories into the living rock of the Colorado Plateau, through the Hohokam who engineered the desert into a garden and sustained their civilization for 14 centuries in the Sonoran heat, through the Sinagua who built their cliff dwellings above the Verde River and gathered around the aftermath of a volcanic eruption to build one of the most diverse communities in the ancient Southwest, through the Mogollon who painted their extraordinary pottery with images of fish and insects and mythological beings and buried it with their dead in a final gift of beauty, through the Hopi who have maintained their ceremonies on their high mesas for 900 years and who carry in their living tradition the memory and the meaning of all that came before, and through the landscape itself, the Grand Canyon, that rupture in the surface of the earth that defeats the human capacity for scale, the painted desert speaking its constant language of color to those who know how to read it, the Sky Island mountains, their forests rising from the desert floor like something from a different world, the Sonoran Desert, harsh and abundant in equal measure, home to life forms of extraordinary ingenuity and beauty. All of it is still here. All of it is waiting, in its patient, ancient way, for whoever comes to it with the attention it deserves. And you have brought that attention tonight. You have been a good traveler in the ancient world. You have asked the right questions, even though the answers were mostly silence. You have sat with the mystery without demanding that it resolve itself. You have let the ancient places speak, in whatever language they speak, and you have listened with whatever part of you still knows how to listen to things that are very, very old. That is enough. That is more than enough. Now let yourself rest. The ancient Arizonans rested. Every night, for 15,000 years, someone in Arizona lay down on the earth and let the darkness receive them. Let the breathing slow. Let the work of the day release. Let the body do its essential, healing, necessary work of restoration. You are that person tonight. the latest in a line 15,000 years long, and after you, others will come, others who will lie down in the darkness of Arizona or of wherever they are, and let the ancient planet hold them through the night. The line does not end. It continues, as it has always continued, as it will continue long after any of us can imagine. You are part of it. You are held by it. Let yourself be held. Breathe in, breathe out. Let the breath come and go like the seasons, like the sun moving north and south along the horizon through the year, like the Colorado River rising and falling with the snow melt and the rains, like everything that breathes and ebbs and flows in the ancient, patient world of Arizona. You are home. Wherever you are home. The earth is beneath you, the sky is above you, and in the space between, you are resting. 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 Good night. Good night. Good night.